So, good evening, everybody. Today, it is my extraordinary pleasure to introduce as the next speaker in our series, War in Ukraine, Destruction of Heritage, Mastering Legacy, my dear colleague and friend, Andrii Portnov. Andrii Portnov is professor of entangled history of Ukraine and the director of the Viadrina Center of Polish and Ukrainian Studies at the European University, Viadrina at Frankfurt-Oder, as probably all of you know. But maybe some of the students who came from Frankfurt, all the way from Frankfurt, don't know every detail of Andrii's curriculum, so I will introduce him here. He graduated from the universities of Dnipro and Warsaw and defended his PhD thesis in 2005 on the Ukrainian emigration in interwar Poland at the Ivan Krypiakiewicz Institute of Ukrainian Studies in Lviv. In the years 2006 to 10, Andrii Portnov worked as editor-in-chief of the Kiev-based Journal of Humanities, Ukraina Moderna. In 2012, Andrii came to Berlin, and I remember the moment when we met first at the Heinrich Böll Stiftung. Andrii came to Berlin as a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study, Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. And in 2013, funded by an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, he started to teach at the Institute of Slavic and Hungarian Studies at Humboldt University, and in parallel worked on his research project at the Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam. In 2015, he was awarded the Baron Welge Prize and held a series of lectures at the International Chair for the History of the Second World War at the Free University of Brussels. Andrii has conducted research and lectured at many universities over the whole of Europe, in Basel, in Cambridge, Geneva, Potsdam, at the Free University Berlin, at Sciences Po Paris, Sciences Po Lyon, the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and the Historisches Kolleg in Munich. In 2015, Andrii initiated and co-founded the Berlin-Brandenburg-Ukraine Initiative, which became the Prisma Ukraina Research Network for Eastern Europe at the Forum Transregionale Studien Berlin. And in 2018, finally, he was appointed a professor of entangled history at the European University Viadrina. And only 2 years ago, by now, he became director of the Center for Polish and Ukrainian Studies. Andrii was awarded several international prizes. In 2022, he was awarded the Dialogue Prize for the German-Polish Society for his commitment to the dissemination of knowledge about Ukraine and its historical entanglements in Europe. And it's a pity that Andrii so far was not awarded a German prize for his commitment in this field, because nobody, I think, is as important as you are for the support and dissemination of Ukrainian studies in the German context. Andrii's publications deal with intellectual history, historiography, genocide, and memory studies in Central and Eastern Europe. Andrii co-edited a whole series of volumes, among them Official History in Eastern Europe, Osnabrück 2020, and Histoire partagée, Mémoire divisée, Ukraine, Russie, Pologne, Lausanne 2020. His book, short book, Poland and Ukraine, Entangled History, Asymmetric Memories, was published in English, in German, in Polish, and in Ukrainian between 21 and 23. Most recently, Andrii Portnov published this very important monograph, Dnipro, An Entangled History of a European City, Boston 2022, which is a fascinating portrait of a city that, to quote Ulrich Schmidt, evolved from a new Athens in the south of Imperial Russia to a Soviet Manchester and finally to a stronghold of Ukrainian independence. It is not by chance that this monograph won the Ab Imperio Book Prize, and I think it will be awarded many more prizes in the future. Today, we are going to listen to Andrii's lecture, Ukrainian Soviet Patriotism, a Historical Phenomenon and its Post-1991 Aftermath. Andrii, welcome.
Good evening, dear colleagues. Thank you, dear Susie. Actually, I'm very grateful for this reminder about the conference at Heinrich Böll Stiftung where we first met. And I should also add that I'm very happy to be part of this lecture series, right? Organized together by many institutions and universities, also our Viadrina University. But of course, for me, being in Humboldt, being at a place where I started my teaching in Germany, it was the first place where I gave my first lectures. That's of course a special privilege and special pleasure. So thank you very much. And actually, for our plan for today is pretty tense. So we need to go through a lot of events and personalities. So before diving direct into the topic, I want not to forget this, to thank, of course, also all of you, because there are my former students in this room, there are my friends from the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin mentioned above, my friends from Zeus, from Uni Potsdam, it's also almost my second or third alma mater, if I may say so. So I'm very, very grateful for all of you to come, from the FU, of course, also, the place where I gave some lectures as well. And I decided, dear colleagues, maybe it's a bit strange, but I hope you'll forgive me, because,
just for 1 minute, I will
please.
interrupt you because I forgot some important. So, Andrii's lecture will be recorded. We will stop the recording after the lecture.
Really, maybe we should stop it right now, but okay,
no
okay.
recording of the discussion.
Oh.
And also at the back of the hall for the KIU newsletter. Please register if you want to receive the newsletter, and we will take pictures. So hopefully you will allow us to take pictures.
Okay, so if we are by the announcements, and of course we should, now you know that the most interesting part is discussion, because it will not be recorded, so it will be just one time, Erlebnis, I've forgotten this word in English. So if we are in the announcements, I allow myself, dear colleagues, and I hope that organizers will forgive me, to announce a book of mine which is coming this spring. And actually this book is a result not just of my work, it's the result of all this lecturing and meeting people, mostly in Berlin and Brandenburg. And this book will be in German. It will be an attempt to, how to put it, let's say, to give a very brief, short introduction into what we are calling Ukrainian studies, or studies of Ukraine, or whatever you want to call. So now, what I'm doing now, look, I'm not sure whether it will be enough copies for all of you because you came so many people. So I'm going with this short information about the book. You like look at it and of course feel free to order or maybe to review, to comment, maybe to discuss it actually at the whole. Why not? We could do it at this point as well. Oh, thank you so much, dear Susie. You helped me to do that. That's great. Thank you so much indeed. And now, what is my plan for today, for tonight? My plan is, as I said, is very ambitious because in order to seriously start, of course only start, talking about such phenomenon as Soviet Ukraine and identity politics there, we need to have a kind of an overview of decades, dear colleagues. We could not just, unfortunately, okay, maybe we could, but it's not my way of doing it, to focus on, let's say, 10 years just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, or 10 years just after it was created. No, we should somehow go through all those events. And in order to do that, I designed a number of slides. And the point is like that. Now listen carefully. So I'm not going to read to you all the information that is given on a slide, okay? So like you do it yourself. So you read it, you like keep careful, attentive, and I'm kind of like commenting on it. That will hopefully spare some time for our discussion, because otherwise, believe me, I'm not interested in just giving a talk and not listening to your disagreements, maybe even disappointments, and so on. Now, before we start with the slides, please think seriously about two very important things. First of all, the title of this talk. Frankly speaking, it came a bit spontaneously because we've discussed it with Susie and Lucas, and it was not really not too much time to think about it. But when I've started seriously thinking about it yesterday, I came to the conclusion that I don't actually know why, but in the title, I put the order of words like that. So Ukrainian Soviet patriotism. And then I asked myself, okay, and why not Soviet Ukrainian patriotism? In fact, that's a very important point, dear colleagues, because I would try to show you that this phenomena somehow developed, evolved historically from predominantly Ukrainian Soviet patriotism to Soviet Ukrainian patriotism. So Soviet became more important than Ukrainian, but not immediately, but through the history of the Soviet Union. That's first. Secondly, I hope you know that already. If not, you should believe me, that if you look at the entire Soviet experience, not just in Ukraine, everywhere, you'll see this extremely interesting, let's say, competition, coexistence, whatever we call it, between two very problematic notions. One is patriotism, in the title of my talk. Another one is, of course, nationalism. Speaking primitively, nationalism was supposed to be very bad, and not just bad as bad, but bad as a reason for repressions. Sometimes physical, sometimes maybe not physical, but still very harmful. Like, for instance, people lost their jobs, right? Possibilities to study, to finish their education. Patriotism was a positive concept, patriotism. We were all supposed to be Soviet patriots. But then, as you could imagine, for those people who were involved in dissident movements or other types of, let's say, at least partly unofficial activities, this term became a kind of symbol of Soviet oppressive system. And was not very, how to put it, like, was not treated purely positively, as it was maybe supposed by the guys who proposed it. So please keep it in mind, because you'll find, I hope so at least, in some quotes, you'll find those references to Soviet patriotism, and you'll see how people in different times like tried to put it all together. And now, let's try to grasp this phenomenon, and I should tell you, I believe that it's really, it could be very helpful and important in understanding what's going on in Ukraine since 1991, and even nowadays. Even though nowadays is not a part of, you see what I've done? That was not deliberately. It's not part of my talk, so maybe during discussion. Good. So, as we all know, dear colleagues, in the early 1920s, the entire Soviet Union, not just Ukraine, the entire Soviet Union, so all those republics, they went through the politics of so-called korenization, right? Or in English, it's usually translated not precisely correctly as indigenization, but that's, of course, like taking the American concept to the Soviet reality, so korenizatsiya. In case of Ukraine, it was called Ukrainization, and here you could read a short list of the main measures adopted by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine. Now, when you read this list, dear colleagues, and when you are like thinking, okay, like why the Bolsheviks who won the war, and they won this war among many other enemies. There were different enemies. There were, for instance, pro-monarchy Russian, white Russian forces, right? But there were also a number of Ukrainian governments, Ukrainian socialist governments, Ukrainian conservative governments like Hetman Skoropadsky and many others. So why the Bolsheviks, who won over different types of Ukrainian political projects in 1970, 1990, why they decided to promote the project that kind of seemed to be not their own, because their own was what? Building communism, right? International project written down in Marx writings and texts of other prominent communist thinkers. Interesting question, no easy answer. But let's listen to people involved in the process. One of the most prominent figures in Ukraine, in Soviet Ukraine in the 1920s, was Mykola Khmelyovy. He was a writer, but he was also a prominent party member. So he wasn't not just a writer, he was part of establishment, no doubt about it. And this guy, part of the establishment, in the year of 1926, it's very early, 26, he wrote a pamphlet which caused a lot of trouble to him, Ukraine or Little Russia. Little Russia here is a kind of a pejorative, derogatory term, right? So like Ukraine is Ukraine, Little Russia is a province, a victim of imperial politics. And in this pamphlet, there are a lot of interesting points. One of them is here, you could read it, and again, try to feel it. The guy who is Ukrainian communist says, Ukraine is independent, not because we communists desire this. Of course not. But because the iron and irresistible will of the laws of history, and that's very Marxist language, irresistible law of history, demands it, because only in this way shall we hasten class differentiation in Ukraine. Oh, very interesting. If you look carefully at the brief information about Khmelyovy here, you see the year of his death, 1933. A lot of you probably know what happened to him, so the guy killed himself. The guy killed himself in his apartment in Kharkiv, apparently being unsatisfied on what is going on in the Soviet Union and in Soviet politics in Ukraine. Before killing himself, he condemned himself for writing stuff like that, and he said that I was wrong. He was forced to say that, of course, he was forced to say that. I was wrong because by saying something like that, independent Ukraine, laws of history, I'm helping those bloody Ukrainian nationalists abroad. And here we come to this actually like contradiction. So you could, maybe you're not, that's like a question mark here, speak about independent Ukraine in the Soviet context, but you should be aware that this could be used by our enemies on the other side of the line. So first and foremost in Poland. Okay, the next guy, the head of the Ukrainian Commissariat of Education, Mykola Skripnik, immediately, dear colleagues, you see the same year of death, the same reason. He also shot himself. Now, how Skripnik, who was a friend of Lenin, an old member of Communist Party, how he explained, not to himself, but also to his party colleagues, why Ukrainization is needed. Read this quote carefully, it's really interesting, because Skripnik said the main point is about struggling for the peasantry. Why for the peasantry? Again, nowadays it's maybe not so obvious, but of course in the late 90s, early 20th century, peasants, the social group, social stratum, it was like more than 90% of population, almost everywhere in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine for sure. In other words, if you're talking about like literally people living in the territory of Soviet Ukraine, we are first and foremost talking about peasants. And then Skripnik is saying, look, that revolution happened in the cities. At first in Petrograd, then in Moscow, then in Kyiv, then in Kharkiv, but not in the village. And if we want to make a revolution really successful, we should bring it to the village. And village is Ukrainian speaking, city is Russian speaking. So he's openly saying that, look, our task is to win over the peasantry with the help of the working class, whether Russian national or Russified. So in other sense, for him, Ukrainization was part of this broader project of social engineering, and building a new communist society. Again, the guy was still accused of being a nationalist. And he ended his life, as we already know the story. Okay, let's keep those quotes in mind. I mean, the notions of laws of history, village, city, and look what we have next. That's about the practice. Because again, it's like nowadays. You could have a propaganda points and you could have real life, everyday experiences. Believe me, there are much more quotes. I decided to bring you this one because it's from my native city of Dnipro. Susie already explained why it's so important. And secondly, because it's really interesting. The guy is one of the leading Soviet physicists involved in the creation of the nuclear weapons. That's a very reasonable, interesting topic nowadays. Isaac Khalatnikov, who lived a long life, as you see, 100 years. He was a prominent professor in Moscow, before that in Kharkiv, a Landau student, but he was born and started his education in Dnipro. You could read how he, in his memoirs, written many years afterwards, in Moscow, in Russian, how he recalled the politics of Ukrainization. He said it was natural to us. To us, in this case, means what? Means Jewish kids, because he was from the Jewish family, so Jewish kids in Dnipro who have to go to Ukrainian school, because if you remember the first slide, Ukrainization of education was one of the most important parts of this politics. I mean, having Ukrainian textbooks, so all these subjects, not just literature, also physics or mathematics. So the guy started doing physics in Ukrainian. Then, of course, he switched, as you could imagine, but it happened later on, in the 30s. And look, I myself spoke Russian with an accent, because Ukrainian was more familiar to me. Now, why it's interesting? It's interesting because people like him, they just entered their more or less adult life after the revolutions, and they try to figure out what's going on in the Soviet Union. Like what's going on? Why should we, Jewish kids in Dnipro, in Katerinoslav at the moment, learn Ukrainian all of a sudden? Believe me that historians nowadays ask the same questions. Sometimes very famous, prominent people like Terry Martin, they say, it was a kind of affirmative action, like in the US. Yeah, we have different types of affirmative actions for discriminated indigenous people, so the same was done by the Bolsheviks. As for me, I was always rather skeptical about this approach. I find this one much better. So Francina Hirsch, another prominent American historian, who suggested to talk about Soviet state-sponsored evolutionism. That's her term. What are we talking about? She looked not just at Ukraine, she looked at all the republics, also Central Asia, Caucasus, because let's not forget, it was not just about Soviet Ukraine. I mean, this promotion of national language, national cadres, translations of the books. It was also done literally everywhere, and also in the national districts, like Crimean Tatar, for instance, or Tatar in Tatarstan, and so on. So she's trying to say that the short-term goal was to make the Soviet regime different from imperialist powers all around it. I mean the capitalist countries, of course. While the strategic goal was to usher the entire population through the Marxist timeline of historical development. So from, let's say, pre-national to national stage, and then to supranational. Morgan is good. Right. And then supranational, so communist society with no nations and classes, right? Right. And if you want to come to this final point, you should go through all the stages, not just jumping like that, directly there. No. You go through the nation state. Now you see? Okay. Not good. Dear colleagues, look, this point about imperialist powers is very important here, because we're talking about 1920s, when the main neighbors of the Soviet Union in the West, they were countries where you also have a lot of Ukrainians living there. So, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, all of them have Ukrainian minorities, the biggest one in Poland. In case of Poland, we're talking about, we have no exact numbers, but it's like around 5 million people. So it's a huge number. It's a really huge number. And the Soviet politics was very much framed, not forget about it, by the Soviet-Polish War in 1920, which was actually lost by the Soviet side. So the troops came up until Warsaw and they were defeated. So Stalin was literally afraid of Pilsudski, of Poland, and of potential Polish offensive towards Kyiv. Kyiv was a border city, think about it. In 1920s, it was a border city, not so far away from Polish. Now, this international aspect is very, I think it will help me now all the time, very good. So international aspect is very important in this respect. And now, like going in even deeper into this direction, and giving you a quote from a rather old article. It was written, in the 70s, in early 80s, by Ivan Lysiak Rudnitsky, a famous Ukrainian, American, Canadian historian. And Lysiak Rudnitsky tried to explain the same story we are trying to explain now, like why Soviet Union existed as a kind of a semi-national state. And he spoke about an embodiment of a compromise. I find it's very nice definition. The embodiment of a compromise between Ukrainian nationalism, here you have nationalism in a broad meaning, of course, not in the Soviet propaganda meaning, and Russian centralism, reached after all the revolutions and wars in 1917 and 1921. So what was this compromise about? On the one hand, Russia, as Rudnitsky wrote, retained political control over Ukraine. No doubt about it. But Ukraine preserved the status of a nation and the recognition of her statehood in the form of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Don't forget, dear colleagues, in the Russian Empire, there were no Ukrainians, as a legal category. There were people speaking little Russian language or dialect. That's it. It was under the Soviet regime that the nationality Ukrainian was finally established legally. Again, legally. I'm not talking about let's say imaginations. I'm talking about legal categories. In legal sense, there were no Ukrainians in the Russian Empire, but there were Ukrainians in the Soviet Union, and that's the fundamental difference. And the logic of this difference is explained by this quote, said that it was a compromise. Okay, if it's a compromise, if you know that all the time, then first of all, it has its price. Secondly, it could not last forever. It depends. Sometimes it's just for, half an hour, maybe 2 years. In this case, it lasted very long. Furthermore, it was used by the Soviet regime all the time, already in the 1920s, but especially during the Second World War, as an argument for what? For reclaiming Ukrainian and Belarusian territories from Poland. Please don't forget that. If you read, and actually I recommend you to do that carefully, all those negotiations in Yalta, in Potsdam, in Tehran, even earlier, it was all about it. The main Stalin's argument about why they need Lviv and Minsk in the Soviet Union was that they are historical, traditional part of ethnographic Ukraine and Belarus. And that's exactly the point of Ukrainian national movement. So the Soviet regime used the ideas of Ukrainian nationalist movement for its own imperialist policy. Think about it. Now, some clever people started feeling it already in the 1920s. Look, a very good historian, completely forgotten, unfortunately, Volodymyr Sukhin-Nahomenko. A good example of a Ukrainian Marxist historian. If some of you would look for an argument for colonial status of Ukraine in the Russian Empire, read this guy. It's like the best analytical argumentation why it was a colony. Now, Sukhin-Nahomenko, in May 1929, during the discussion about history of Ukraine, made this quote. Frankly speaking, I was almost shocked when I found it out. Look, he said, what is Ukrainization and our Ukrainian statehood? Is it an integral part of the process of socialist construction? Or is just a maneuver to blindfold Western Ukraine and Western Ukrainians in order to attract them to us, and then not to care about this matter? As you could imagine, not too many people listened carefully to Homenko. He was persecuted for this talk, not killed, because you see that he died in 68 as a completely forgotten guy in the province. But this quote helps us to feel the importance of this geopolitical issue here. So it's not just about, let's say, Ukrainians and Russians, or even not just about Soviet Union. It's about international politics. It's about an attempt of Soviet Union to be an international actor and to play with those millions of Ukrainians living outside the Soviet Ukraine, first and foremost in Poland. Now, dear colleagues, we all know what happened later on. That's 29. In 10 years, 39, the Second World War started. And then, in the same year, 39, so in 10 years, in September, Soviet troops came where? To West Ukraine, to Lviv. And they came and said, guys, we came to liberate you from the Polish oppression. We will live happily in one unified Ukrainian, Soviet, but Ukrainian state. And a lot of people believed that. Not all, of course, not all of them. It also came with repressions against the Greek Catholic Church, against some intellectuals. But the point, ideological point, was like that. We are like taking you back to this big project of unified Ukraine. And that was just the beginning of the story. When the Second World War continued, you know that Stalin, he proved to be a pretty clever, let's say, tactical guy in the course of the war. At some point, he started playing with the Russian Orthodox Church to gain the support of the church for the anti-German struggle of the population. A bit later, he also started playing with Ukrainian patriotism. That's for later. Look at this picture. That's one of the highest Soviet military orders, established in October 43. Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who's Bogdan Khmelnytsky? So that's the founder of Cossack statehood, right? The guy who started big uprising against whom? The Poles again. And why October 43? Because in October 43, it was exactly when the Soviet troops started recapturing Ukraine. So after the Battle of Kursk, not to mix it up with the ongoing story in Kursk, so after the Battle of Kursk, Soviet troops approached Ukraine and Stalin said, that's the moment to show Ukrainians that we are celebrating their Soviet-Ukrainian patriotism, and they established this order. If you look at the Soviet publications about Khmelnytsky before the war, you'll figure out that the guy was portrayed as a betrayer of socialist revolution who sold the Cossack masses to the Russian Tsar. And now it was all over, and this is another picture. Movie, you could watch it on YouTube tonight, maybe, why not? It's free access. Bogdan Khmelnytsky by Igor Savchenko. So that's a film based on Alexander Kornichuk play. Again, it's a huge patriotic production released in 41, just before the second stage of the Second World War started. Beautifully done. And what is the main point again? Again, it's about Soviet-Ukrainian patriotism, very much anti-Polish and very much pro-Russian. That's like the configuration here. Anti-Polish, pro-Russian, not vice versa. You should be very careful about it. Now, dear colleagues, okay, Second World War, Stalin. It's more or less clear that the guy tried to play this card for his own interests and for the interests of building like the Soviet Union's influence. And actually, let's not forget that when the war was over, he insisted that Ukraine, as well as Belarus, Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Belarus, will become the founding member states of the United Nations. And that was done. So think about it. You have three Soviet founding UN nations. Soviet Union in general, not Soviet Russia, Soviet Union, Soviet Belarus, Soviet Ukraine. Based on this logic, dear colleagues, think about it. Think also about something else. Now let's maybe go back to this quote from Rogers Brubaker. That's an obvious fact, actually. There is nothing like very enlightening, it's obvious. But think about this obvious fact seriously, that the Soviet Union codified nationhood and nationality as fundamental social categories. So all people, all citizens of the Union, they have obligatory and only one nationality written down in their documents. You could be Ukrainian, Russian, Jewish, Tatar, but not like Russian/Ukrainian. oh, Jewish, sorry, slash Tata. No, just one, but it was written down, and it played a big role. It was also reason for repression. For instance, when you want to deport all Crimean Tatars, you have the list, because you have the list of people listed down as Crimean Tatars, or as Koreans, or as Germans, of course, as Germans in Volga regions. Now, thank you for the word. It was never organized as a Russian nation state. That's important, dear colleagues. That's very important. At least officially, formally, legally. And furthermore, an irony of history. There's, of course, the words I like about irony of history. History is always about irony, almost always. Even when it's very tragic, it's still ironic. So, why is it the fact that nationality became and remained a basic institutional building block of the Soviet state that proclaimed to be internationalistic, anti-nationalistic, and whatever? Think about it seriously. How could that be? That a project that was not at all about nationality fundamentally, it was about what? Class struggle, right? Building communism, destroying capitalism, stuff like that. That this project codified and like supported nationhood till the very end, till 1991. It never stopped. Till the very end, Soviet citizens, they had nationality as ethnic origin written down. You have Soviet Ukraine as a Soviet republic with a government and even local Academy of Sciences, right? And Ukrainian Soviet Encyclopedia and all of that in Kiev. Why so? Like, why it was never stopped? Think seriously about it. Why after the war? Okay, the war is over. Stalin is still alive. Even Stalin, he never dared to do that, not to mention his... let's talk about this guy. Now, we are moving like quickly, oh my God, we are moving quickly somewhere. So Leonid Brezhnev, as you could imagine, one of the heroes of my book on Dnipro, of course, the guy who was in the head of the Soviet Union for a very long period of time, so 64, 82. Actually, this last picture was taken together with Willy Brandt, but I cut Brandt out of it because they love to spend time together, you know, in Crimea, and yeah, doesn't matter. Now, why Brezhnev is important for our topic? First of all, now I'm somehow like delicately we'll start focusing on Dnipro in post-war years. You'll see why. And secondly, because actually he was the guy whose party career started in Ukraine. So he started his party career in Ukraine, in Dnipropetrovsk, and later on moved to Moldavia and further on Moldova. Now, that's a very famous document. I like to show it to my students all the time, so I'm sorry, you guys seen it like maybe 10 times now. There's the first Brezhnev's passport, where you could read the third line is nationality, and this line says Ukrainian. So Brezhnev was Ukrainian. Don't forget it. Okay, he got another passport later on in Moscow, and in this second passport it was Russian. Why so? That's an important question. Why it was important for him, like a prominent communist leader, at first of the local level, to be written down and registered as Ukrainian? The answer is actually very simple. Because if you are doing your career in Soviet Ukraine, it's better. It is even like, it's kind of expected too, that you belong to the local titular nationality. The same would be true for Kazakhstan, for Latvia, for, name it, all of them. When you move to Moscow, then like, okay, in Moscow maybe it's better to be Russian because Russians is the biggest group in the Soviet Union. And for Brezhnev, who was actually, if you read his memoirs, we know that he would actually stress a lot. And I would say he or the guys who wrote it for him, and stressed no reason, that in his childhood he was used to hear different languages in Kamenskaya, Dniprodzerzhinsk. I mean, Ukrainian, Polish, there were a lot of Polish workers, Yiddish, for sure, a lot of Jews there, and Russian. So he was kind of like 4 languages, and then he decided to pick one of them, not Yiddish, as you could imagine, Okay, why Brezhnev is important for our topic? Because we'll not talk about him, we'll talk about Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Dnipro. Look, that's the railway station. Actually, one of the buildings, now it was hurt by the Russian rocket, but it looks more or less like that also nowadays in Dnipro. And here you have the official Soviet emblem of the city. And look carefully, dear colleagues, always look carefully. And you'll see that the inscription is made in Ukrainian. So, the predominantly Russian-speaking big industrial city, closed for the foreigners because of the rockets, right? It has its emblem, and the emblem says in Ukrainian, Dnipropetrovsk. Why should you do that? Is it so important? Actually, yes, it was important. It was part of this topic that we are talking about, part of this, at least demonstrated Soviet-Ukrainian patriotism. Okay, let's focus on this guy now. Petro Shelest. Very important person. Now we're talking about the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine in 63-72, and his book in Ukrainian language called Україна наша радянська, Our Soviet Ukraine, 1970. Book that I, of course, very much recommend to read. It exists in Ukrainian only. You couldn't find Russian translation, German, English, no, Ukrainian only. And believe me, that was already a problem. So when the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine published his book in Ukrainian only, some comrades said, but why in Ukrainian only? Maybe at least the Russian version as well. And furthermore, what this book is about, as you see from the cover, of course, the most important event is the Dnipro RES, Lenin Monument on the Dnipro River, and stuff like that. But if you start reading the book, you'll see that the guy is trying to somehow link or present the achievements of the Soviet Ukraine, different cities and regions of Soviet Ukraine, through its history, first and foremost through its Cossack history. So this book is extremely pro-Cossack, so to say. He says Zaporozhian siege, that's the best source of, social movements, whatever in Soviet Ukraine. And, dear colleagues, now, in fact, there was nothing anti-Soviet in saying that. Because Cossacks, already in those movies like Bogdan Khmelnytsky, they were integrated into the canon. It wasn't a forbidden topic. Not at all. The point was, and here, of course, that's really fascinating, but it's impossible to explain in 2, 5, or even 10 minutes. How the topic, which is accepted and allowed, how it could be reinterpreted in a way to portray you, even if you are the first guy in the Communist Party, as a nationalist. Sometimes it happened to him. He was not at all happy about it, So the book was published in 1970, and in 2 years, not full calendar year, so in 2 years, the guy was forced to leave his position. He was removed to Moscow. He spent the rest of his life in Moscow. He had no right to go back to Ukraine. Think about it. Yeah, the big figure in communist, movement, Soviet communist movement. And what was the crime behind it? Now look at the list. I've made a list of crimes listed in the reviews of his book, published in 1972. So they are very interesting. I tried to translate them as close as possible to the original Russian or Ukrainian text. So this book cannot contribute to the education of workers in the spirit of Soviet patriotism. Here we have patriotism. Look. The book devotes an inordinate amount of space to the pre-October history of Ukraine, idealizing the Cossacks, portraying them as a non-class community. Then, very interesting, the beneficial influence of Russian culture is not revealed, or is not enough revealed. Again, it's not true that it's completely not there. If you read the book, especially nowadays, it looks as a pure Soviet propaganda, and believe me, it's not like a hidden nationalistic narrative. But it was not, so this percentage, or the levels was not kept all together. Apparently, one of the big reasons why the party was angry on him was, of course, as you could imagine, dear colleagues, it was not just about ideology. It was about attempts to get rid of a guy who was too strong, right? And to have someone who would work better for the Brezhnev system in the Soviet Union. It was also a problem that he refused to show this book to a central committee before the publication. So he was thinking like that. I am the number one, I'm the first secretary, I publish what I want to publish. No, actually, it's kind of like that, but you still should go through certain procedures. Not like pretend that you are now like doing what you want to do. And as a result, the book was forbidden for sale. It was taken out of the libraries. Because, as you could read here, the development of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic is described in isolation from the overall successes of the Soviet Union. And that was something that you can't allow. So again, Shellist was not arrested. So it's not Stalinist years. So not arrested, not sent to Gulag, but he was sent to Moscow. He was like, it was like all his contacts to Ukraine, official contacts at least, were stopped. The book was confiscated, and and then imagine that you are a Ukrainian writer, or historian, or filmmaker, living and working actively, let's say late 60s, early 70s, right? You know that Shellist is the number one in the Republican Party. You read his articles, you even read his book in 1917, saying that we need to give more attention to the Cossack past. And he said, that's what they want from me. I'll give more attention to the Cossack past as a historian or as a writer. And then like you produce your book and it comes out in 72 and they said, and now this book is already criticized. So like you are helping nationalism to be promoted. You have a trouble. And believe me, a lot of people got in trouble. So in 1972, the same year when Shellist was sent to Moscow, a number of Ukrainian historians, they lost their jobs in Kyiv. I'm not giving the names because it's not for today, but believe me, there are the names of prominent people. Some writers lost their places in the Writers' Union, musicians, because they kind of reacted too slowly, so to say. So like their products came out right in the time when it was not anymore, welcomed. It happens also nowadays, even though propaganda works differently. Now, one of the most interesting cases in this respect is, of course, the case of Olesy Gonchar, a very important Ukrainian writer, accidentally also born in Dnipro. So he's here of my book and this lecture. Now, imagine the guy, as a very young, one could say boy, a teenager, he went to the front, so he was in the Soviet army. He was in the Soviet army in Czechoslovakia, for instance. Then he returned home. He graduated from the Dnipropetrovsk University, philology, and he started publishing books that immediately brought him a big success, because those books about what? About the Second World War, about Soviet patriotism. Stalin himself was very much like in favor of the book. So he made a prominent career. So this guy, being very young, he was already like on the top of the list in Soviet literature with all the, stuff involved. And then came this text, published in the year of 1968. Again, 68, let's think about 68 in Berlin, in West Berlin, in East Berlin, right? In Paris, in New York, and now let's go back to Kyiv. So it's 69 in Kyiv, it's Sobor Olesy Gonchara, published in winter of this year. So you have, this book is from American edition, that's the West German translation, and this one is the Russian publication in the Perestroika years, because in Russian it appeared much later. Now, dear colleagues, no time to go into detail. That's one of my favorite literary works. You could read my articles about it, easily find them in different languages. The point is, when this book was published, now listen carefully, the head of the Dnipropetrovsk local party committee recognized himself in a negative character of the book. Now imagine, not very pleasant situation. Like you are a serious guy, head of the party, and then like you read the novel of a prominent Soviet, welcomed author, and this author is making laughs of someone who looks like you, and in a very bad, So this guy was very angry. So he said like, I'll destroy him, Gonchar. He tried. Actually, he never destroyed him properly, because Shellist very much tried to protect Gonchar, and many other people tried to protect. So it was not as easy as in Stalinist years again to destroy someone with such a reputation. But still it was like, it was not easy. So there was a big campaign against Gonchar, saying that actually in his novel, which also is very much about the Cossack past, here Cossacks coming again, and this Cossack past is again idealized. So you have more or less the same line of argument as in this line. Like, it's okay, but it's too much, it's too less about Russia, it's not enough about internationalist ideas. Now, what is very important, like for our topic here, it's very important that like two texts to be mentioned in this context, and both texts are now, let's say, unofficial or dissident texts, if you wish. The first one is, of course, this text by Ivan Dzyuba, Internationalism or Russification. You see the date, 1965. So it's Shelest, but it's even before the trouble of the Shelest. So the title is great. The title is exactly the problem we are talking about. Yeah? So, if it's Soviet-Ukrainian patriotism, then whether it's internationalism or it's still kind of a new form of Russification. So just like making, like people turn into or switch into Russian language, Russian culture, and so on. Secondly, if so, what about the previous history of Ukrainization? You remember the quotes from Skripnik and the guys from the 20s. So Dzyuba, imagine, he was a literary critic, born in Donetsk, lived in Kiev. He tried to put those stories together, and he said that the problem is that our Soviet Union under Brezhnev somehow moved away from the Leninist principles of national politics. In other words, from the politics of Ukrainization from the 20s. Let's go back to them and it will be fine. So, we'll combine, as Khvylyovy did, we'll combine communism and Ukrainian cultural project. Let's just do it. You could read the quote, of course, and he said that we're not doing that now. We are now doing Russification. So we're just Russifying, and Lenin was a big enemy of Russification, big enemy of Russian chauvinism. Dzyuba, again, this generation of the 60s, he sent his essay by himself, no pressure. He sent it deliberately to the party institutions and saying, like, guys, read my thoughts and let's make Soviet Union great again. What happened to him? KGB came to him and said, Comrade Dzyuba, what's going on? You are distributing anti-Soviet propaganda. He said, no, I'm not. I'm trying to help. He's like, shut up, you are. And he was arrested. Yeah, he spent some time in jail. Later on, in jail and after jail, he agreed to condemn himself and to pay for the possibility to go out with the text that says it was all wrong, no Russification, it's okay, like it's Soviet internationalist project. So, actually, he did the same, dear colleagues. He did the same, let's say, technically, as Khvylyovy, because Khvylyovy also condemned his own writings. He also condemned it. But this condemnation, like you could do it, but the problem remains. That's the real matter. And let's forget maybe this one. Not enough time. Maybe we could back during the discussion. The problem remains. Look how President Kuchma defined this problem in his memoirs. Actually, he was working in Dnipro, so that's important. So the second president of Ukraine was a student, and then later on the director of this rocket factory in Dnipro. So the very same place where Gonchar worked and lived, and Kuchma published a very interesting book called Ukraine is Not Russia in 2003, right before the Orange Revolution. Fascinating reading, highly recommended. Read it now! Read it now! The chapter about Crimea is unbelievable. When you read it now, Gwendolyn agrees, thank you so much. It's really like, it's like, oh my God, 2003. So in this part, he's talking about Soviet rocket industry in Dnipro, so in Soviet Ukraine. Look how he defines the story. He said that for us, Soviet rocket engineers, physicists, it was an ideally Soviet sphere of activity. Ideally Soviet sphere of activity. That is supranational. Or naturally formed a supranational mindset. Very interesting. And actually the guy we know that from this book, the guy came to Dnipro from Chernihiv region with a dream to become a student of Ukrainian literature and then go back as a teacher to Ukrainian school in Chernihiv. And you know this story that he came to this office and other students said, Lyonya, are you stupid? Those students of Ukrainian literature, they got this stipend, which is like, you know, I don't remember like exactly, like 100 rubles. And but this physics, faculty of physics, it's like 300. So you should go there. I said, like, actually, well, why not? He was like, a guy, so his father died at the war. So village boy, privileges in becoming a student. He said, okay, I'll become a Soviet physicist. So again, someone who is of peasant Ukrainian background, he came to a big city of Dnipro, went to this university. He's still alive, as we all know. He's an interesting commentator of political situation, not a stupid guy at all. But look how he describes the situation in the city. So for him, being a rocket engineer was an ideally Soviet, so non-Ukrainian, non-Russian, non-whatever else, but ideally Soviet, supranational sphere of activity. No, that was for him. He was not the only one, as you could imagine. There were people like the authors of this very famous document, List творчей молоди Днепропетровска, or A Letter of the Creative Youth of Dnipropetrovsk, in 1968. So a group of students, actually from Ukrainian philology, now you have those unlucky guys who remained by Ukrainian studies, they were shocked by the fact that university decided not to celebrate Olesi Honchar literary activities, and they, again, they did the same as Dzuba did. So they wrote a letter and they sent it to party officials, seriously. Not to, Radio Liberty, to party officials. And look at that's one of the quotes. And read it carefully, it's very interesting. It says, doesn't the Soviet patriotism, here we have patriotism, but used in a kind of in a way of like approaching the officials. Doesn't the Soviet patriotism of today's Ukrainians include national dignity and a national pride in their great and talented Ukrainian people? Maybe I should tell you what happened to the guys. They were all arrested. The main author was sent to Gulag and actually never made out of it. So he spent the rest of his life in Soviet camps. Some lost their jobs. Some lost. So it's a very like serious repressions. No jokes. Very serious persecutions. But if you look at the text itself, it actually says more or less the same as Dzuba said. It says that let's go back to Leninist democratic. For them there was no contradiction. Leninist democratic national politics from the 1920s. And even more interesting, I've read this letter again yesterday, and I found out that one of the points was about memorials. It said, why in our Ukrainian Soviet Dnipropetrovsk we have memorials only to Russian writers and historical figures? I'm quoting, seriously. They said, let's put a memorial to our Ukrainian local figures like Dmytro Yavornitsky, Les Kurbas. No, as you could, it never happened so far, actually. Maybe we'll come to memorials later on. So the story, this situation was indeed complicated because, on the one hand, you could be severely persecuted for writing down something like that. On the other hand, dear colleagues, once again, Ukrainian nationality as a category, Ukrainian language as a language, Ukrainian as a name, it was never, let's say, taken out of the usage in the Soviet Union. On the contrary, it was used all the time. I could show you, but please really be careful with such numbers because, I once did it at another event in other numbers, and then I come to the discussion was about numbers. The point is not to go, but just to get this feeling. Okay, and then I come into an end. So, the nationality structure of Dnipropetrovsk population in percentage, and that's our official censuses, from the Russian Empire till independent Ukraine. And you could see what happened to the numbers of Ukrainians. In the census of 1897, they were called people who use little Russian language as their mother tongue. Yeah? What happened to Russians and what also happened to the Jews. you see that the number of Jews decreased from 35% to 1%. Now actually it's getting better, really, seriously. Now it's getting better. But still, this difference, 35-1, is impressive. And it's not just the Holocaust. It's the Holocaust, but also some other events. Not the topic for today, of course. But the topic for today is that nationality remained prominent in the entire Soviet history. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, I remember actually those events a little bit myself. Ukraine, as well as Russia, and many other post-Soviet republics, they immediately decided to get rid of this obligatory nationality line in the official documents. So, and to adopt this so-called Western attitude, like nationality means citizenship. Even though it does not mean that this thinking is gone. That's important, dear colleagues. You could take away the terminology, but the thinking is still there. Okay, oh my God, I am coming to an end, finally. Yeah, very good. So that's a famous picture. I think some of you know it. A tragic picture, of course. That's a mosaic in Mariupol, non-existent anymore. Forget about it. Made by Anna Horska in 1968. The same year, 68, actually. The same 68. As you see, Anna Horska died. Actually, she was killed. She was killed by KGB in 2 years in 1970. Ask yourselves, why people like Brezhnev, who switched from Ukrainian to Russian and who was, of course, not at all interested in all these type of national projects, why people like him never tried seriously to stop this entire project of supporting Ukrainian Soviet patriotism and nationality and just switch into Soviet people and whatsoever? It is a very serious question. It's of course a rhetorical one, but try to figure it out. What I could tell you, dear colleagues, that the notion of Soviet people, so советский народ, так, радянский народ, as a new historical community, that's the only quote I have written down, you see, but I want to be as precise as possible. As a new historical community of various nationalities, with, now listen carefully, with a common socialist motherland, a common socialist economy, a common Marxist-Leninist worldview, and the common goal of building the socialism. That was supposed to exist. And this notion of Soviet people was proposed, suggested by Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev in 1961, and repeated by Brezhnev in 1971 in one of his official talks. However, the notion of Soviet people had never replaced the obligatory ethnically defined legal notion of nationality and never shattered the nation-state-like structure of the republics. All that party ideologists dared to introduce was the cautious point of gradual rapprochement, постепенное сближение, so поступовое сближение of the Soviet nationalities. And then, as we all know, the Soviet Union in 1991 collapsed according to what? To the borders of the Soviet republics, defined as a semi-nation states. And then we have a problem with it like nowadays in some parts of this space. Not just in Ukraine, also in case of Azerbaijan, Armenia, right, and some parts of Georgia and so on. Now, very briefly about the aftermath, and then we could discuss it in detail later on. Nowadays, there is a trend, and I find it's actually very relevant and important, and I'm actually grateful to our German colleagues who support it, to be careful and to criticize the notion of post-Soviet. Because if you just call Ukraine post-Soviet, then it gives this impression that it has no agency of its own, like it just like posts something. At the same time, we all know that, of course, Ukraine, as well as Russia, or Belarus, or Moldova, or Kazakhstan, or even Estonia or Latvia, they have a lot of, let's say, problems, structures, economical, social, religious, whatever, that could be traced back to their Soviet history. That's obvious. You could not pretend it's not like that. And for instance, again, if you look at the Dnieper nowadays, you'll see that the memorials, the biggest memorials still left in the city, memorials to Taras Shevchenko, they were both built when? In the Soviet times by the Soviet officials. So they are part of this project of Soviet Ukrainian patriotism or Ukrainian Soviet patriotism, and they are still there, unlike those memorials that were complained by the authors of the Letter of the Creative Youth. They were now destroyed and removed. What should happen to Shevchenko memorials in this respect? I don't know. Like, it's an open question to think about. What should happen to the entire infrastructure linked to this project we've discussed about? That's a very big issue also for the future debates when the war is over. But it's clear that those two notions, Soviet and Ukrainian, they could not be in historical categories, just, easily set apart. Because for a long period of time, they belonged to the same phenomenon. And even if you don't like this phenomena, it's still there. And that's the problem. That's what history is about. Thank you very much for your attention.